Dr. Michael S. Russo, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at Molloy College. I'm also the Associate Director of our Molloy College Center for Social and Ethical Concerns. We are going to be doing a multi-part series on several problems that we think are important enough to address as we move into the 21st century. And the first topic we want to deal with is the issue of consumerism and its effect on American culture and society. We then want to propose an alternative, and that alternative is known as the voluntary simplicity movement. And it's a movement that is taking hold throughout the United States. I'd like to begin by asking you to think about your own dream life. If you could have your dream life, what would that include? What kind of house would you want? What kind of car or cars would you want to have? What kind of vacations would you want to go on? What other sort of stuff would you like to have in your home and in your life? Is there anything else that you might include in this dream life of yours? You know, I think about myself. If I had to envision a dream life, it would be the big country house with a lot of property, trees. I'd want to have this nice stereo system, a decent car to get back and forth. I mean, this would be part of my dream life. But what would yours include? You know, for many Americans, that dream life would probably be a mansion on the water. It might include an SUV, a sports car, maybe very nice clothes. It might also include jewelry, electronic items. You think about what it is that excites you and what your dream life would involve. Now let's go back a bit. Let's think about the dream life for the average American in about 1957. What would that dream life involve? Well, first of all, you have to picture Americans after World War II. American soldiers coming back from World War II, coming back to places like New York, and they were living for the most part in apartments, two-family houses. Maybe they didn't have cars. Maybe they didn't have a lot of clothes, a lot of possessions. What was their dream? Well, the dream of the average American GI and his family in 1957 would have included a house. But what would that house have been like? It certainly wouldn't be the kind of house that we envision as part of our dream. It might have been the kind of house you would find in the Levittown development. It might include 2 bedrooms, an eating kitchen, probably no basement, small yard for the children to play in. Definitely a very different vision than we would have today. Then vision might include a car as well. 1 car for the family, maybe a station wagon. The vacations of that GI would be very different than the kind of dream life we envision for ourselves today. What kind of vacations might they take? They might have been happy to go to the Jersey Shore, perhaps to upstate New York. I'm talking now for people in our area in New York. And as for stuff, you know, the icebox, a refrigerator, a black and white TV, I mean, there were certain things that people would have wanted even in 1957. But again, think about how different the dream of the greatest generation was compared to our own dreams. If you think about your lifestyle today, and you think about what you spend your money on, you probably spend your money on a lot of stuff that really isn't all that important or necessary for your life. I mean, how much do you spend on food in your house? How much do you spend on food eating out? How often do you eat out? What kind of clothes do you spend money on? I mean, do you spend money on a weekly basis on these items? What do you need for transportation? What kind of car do you have? And what about education? How much money are you spending on that? As you think about your typical expenses, what you might want to reflect upon is, are there any consistent consumption patterns that you have? Are there any things that you're spending a lot of your hard-earned income on that maybe aren't all that necessary, maybe that don't bring you the kind of happiness you're looking for in life? In fact, this connection of consumption with happiness leads to the exact opposite very often of happiness. In fact, John DeGraff refers to consumerism by a different name. He says consumerism really ought to be called affluenza. Now, what exactly is affluenza? Well, he defines it as a painful, contagious, socially transmitted condition of overload, debt, anxiety and waste, resulting from the dogged pursuit of more. It almost sounds like a disease, and in fact, that's exactly what consumerism is, a disease. And what are the symptoms of this disease? Well, de Graaf in his wonderful book, Affluenza, goes through several of these symptoms. And of course, the most obvious one is unnecessary shopping. I mean, we think about how much time the average American spends going to the mall, going to stores, buying clothes. I mean, the typical students I teach, they spend hundreds of dollars every year just on shoes alone. Forget about the pocketbooks, the other accessories, the other clothing. Do we really need all these things? And what are we trying to cover up in our attempt to create happiness from consumption? Do we really achieve our goals? So, unnecessary shopping, and you could think about your own life, and you could think about, what are you buying that you really don't need? The second symptom that de Graaf talks about is excessive credit card use. And we know that many Americans have gotten into some serious trouble in recent years because they went overboard on credit card debt. And then the hens came home to roost when they had to pay them off. The credit card companies actually love the fact that people are spending beyond their means, using credit to buy stuff they don't need, and putting themselves further and further into debt. The interest on credit cards is what's keeping many banks afloat. But you can think about how much stress there is in the life of the average American when they keep getting these credit card bills and they keep mounting and getting larger and larger. So what does all this credit card use lead to? It leads to an exorbitant amount of debt. It leads to people who really don't have very much savings, very few funds put away for the rainy day, for emergencies, creating additional stress in the life of the typical American family. So we have all of these funds that we're spending on all this stuff, and our homes are filled with all of this garbage that we don't need, that don't really bring us happiness, because most of the stuff we have, really, after a while, we grow bored with. It gets tossed to the side, it gets put in the garage, put in the attic, and we really don't even think about it anymore. But it's there, it's taking up our space. And so we work to buy stuff, and we're working, in fact, more hours than ever in the United States. I mean, Americans are probably the most overworked people in the world. They are also the most sleep-deprived people in the world, not coincidentally. Between the period 1967 and 2000, if you look at the number of annual hours worked, we've gone from 1,716 hours in 1967 to 1,878. We have less vacation time, less relaxation time, less time with our families, less time for community. These are the impacts of our consumptive lifestyle, the impacts of what de Graaf calls affluenza. Ultimately, this leads to a kind of spiritual crisis, because a society in which meaning, purpose, and worth are determined based upon the stuff that people possess rather than the contents of their character or the state of their souls, this is a society that is in a deep spiritual crisis. And Mother Teresa once said that, we Americans are the poorest people in the world. Well, she didn't mean we're poor because of the lack of possessions, far from it. She meant we're poor because we're spiritually poor. When one derives one's meaning and one's purpose from the amount of possessions one has, one will inevitably be spiritually poor. This leads us to another question. Is consumerism an addiction? I mean, we think of addictions, we think of drug addiction, alcohol addiction. Consumerism doesn't seem to be in that same category. Well, if we go back to St. Augustine, who basically, in the Middle Ages understood what an addiction was because he suffered from one himself, he says, what is addictive behavior? We have an urge, we act upon the urge, there's repetition, the need for greater stimulation, because now the repetition means we're not getting the same pleasure that we got before. This becomes habitual behavior and eventually an addiction that we can't break on our own. And you think about consumerism in this way. The need to go to the store regularly, to buy Uggs, to buy iPods, to buy all these things that are so important to us. Well, after a while, I wonder, does this become addictive behavior? Can one break free of the need to derive one's happiness and meaning from shopping. Actually, Epicurus understood in antiquity that consumerism couldn't buy happiness. I mean, his famous line is, "Give me a little pot of cheese and I'll have a feast for a lifetime." What Epicurus understood, and what the great philosophers all understood, is that it doesn't take much to bring one happiness. But if one is always desiring more and more, that's actually frustrating that end that we so long for. There is something known as the fulfillment curve, and psychologists have studied this problem of happiness for quite a while. And what they've discovered is people who lack the basic necessities of life, when asked to describe their level of happiness, of course, these are people who describe themselves as being fairly unhappy. As their basic needs are met, the level of happiness that they experience naturally goes up. So this would be the difference between someone who barely is able to survive, who can barely provide a roof over his or her head, or enough food for their family. And now we have moved into a level where we're able to pay for those basic necessities. We're able to pay our mortgage or our rent. We have a car or the means to get around. Those people naturally describe themselves as being happier than the people who lack these basic necessities. And then you get to the point where I'm a little beyond that point even, where in fact now I could take a vacation every now and then. I can go to the movies, go out to dinner every now and then, and those people are basically the most happy people in our society. As we go beyond that level, the level of having enough comfort that we're not always having to think about money and having to struggle for money, we get beyond that to the point where our lives are filled with luxuries. We have more wealth that we know what to do with. We desire more luxury items than we really need. And interestingly, those people describe themselves as being as unhappy as the people who lack the basic necessities of life. We can look at countries too. America is one of the most consumeristic countries on the planet. And so you would think, when they do studies of different countries and fulfillment levels and satisfaction, happiness, the United States would be right up there, one of the happiest countries in the world. In fact, this is not the case. If you look at the rankings consistently, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Sweden, all rank at the top in terms of the happiest places. These are not the places where people have exorbitant lifestyles necessarily, but in fact, these are places where basic needs are provided for. So I think we in the United States need to reflect, why is it people in these other countries experience such a high degree of happiness when we barely make the top 10? I think what I'm saying goes against the grain for many Americans. We've been led to believe that happiness is directly connected with the amount of stuff we're able to possess and to buy, the amount of wealth we have, and in fact, study after study indicates that this is not the case, that in fact, there's a high degree of unhappiness in the United States on the part of those people who consume the most. And again, we get back to the issue of spiritual satisfaction which cannot be derived from the mere possession of things. We've basically been sold a bill of goods here in the United States. We've been led to believe that it is consumption that brings happiness. It's the amount of stuff that we possess that make us happiest. And in fact, this is not the case. And I'd ask you to think about your own life and to reflect for a moment on what it is that brings you happiness. Is it going to the mall and buying things? Or is it time spent with family? Is it opportunities for creative expression? Is it hanging out with your friends? Perhaps communing with nature? These are the things that many people, when pressed, would say bring them the greatest amount of happiness.